Take a look behind the curtain with a real whistleblower and American patriot. Prepare to embrace the uncomfortable truth because this program has no time for comforting lies. Here is civil liberties enthusiast, Second Amendment defender, and recovering FBI agent Kyle Seraphin.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Kyle Seraphin Show. We've got kind of a inspirational show today, in so much as I woke up inspired to give it to you and share this information, which I don't actually think is going to encourage you. It's going to start your week off on maybe a negative note, but it is a note that I think we should all be aware of. Today's episode is about an old historical adage. Those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. And a lot of us have kind of a sense of what that means. We think that it means that you're in a position of power and that you're going to be making the decisions. And when you don't know what happened in history, then you're likely to make the same mistakes of those who committed them earlier. I'm going to ask you to reframe that old adage in a way that's a little bit different. What I think that adage means is that those who do not know the warnings of history are likely to suffer the same fates as those who suffered them historically. And I think that is actually a profound change in what that actual adage means. The failings of history were those of the ruling class, of the powerful. And most of us are not in that category. In fact, most of us just experience whatever tyranny or democratic process is allowed by those who have the power. And so if we don't know the historical lessons, the dangers that exist in our historical record, then we are likely to suffer the same fates as those who suffered them historically. That is my perspective. And I think we're going to try to prove this thing out. It's kind of scary stuff. It's not a really uplifting topic, but it is something I literally woke up at 5 a.m. this morning, came out of a dead sleep. And that was what occurred to me, that some of this stuff has all happened before. Many of us have these instincts. I just saw that FBI panty raid, who's one of our regular contributors in the live chat. And by the way, shameless plug for the live chat. If you don't watch us on Rumble, you can come join us on rumble.com/Kyle Seraphin/live for every one of our live shows. The live chat is always bumping. And one of our regular contributors has a poll on Twitter right now asking, what do we think is going to happen in the 2024 election? Will we get the result that we expect? Will it be rigged, or will there be no election at all? And overwhelmingly, friends of mine who work in the intelligence community and have been around this sort of thing have this same fear. Option number 3, will there be anything at all? There's some kind of clues in history if we can dig back into it. And I don't think it feels very good. Let me do the sponsors real quick right now. Let's go ahead and say thanks to the folks that are keeping the lights on over here. I want to clue you guys in about my favorite, which is The Loop. This is coming in from Catholic Vote, and then we're going to get deep into this kind of topic. And like I said, kind of a dark way to start a Monday, but we might as well be forewarned instead of going into it blindly like sheep. So first of all, Catholic Vote, we're very appreciative of them. Go to catholicvote.org. You can sign up for The Loop. There's The Loop right there. And I'm going to read you some of the things that are in Monday's Loop. I got it at 4:56 a.m. this morning in my email box. The Loop says there's an article about the feds unleashing more regulations on water heaters. A Biden DEI hire, this is the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has brought on a Air Force general who is going to push for more LGBTQ stuff in our military, because God knows why. A court said that the FBI spied on elected officials, which we all know about. We're actually going to cover more of 702 later on in this week. It is a topic that never can be talked about too much. There's a story about nurses being forced to buy into CRT in Kentucky. A Vermont coach, who apparently they have snowboarding coaches in Vermont, that's also news to me, fired over making comments about trans people. That's kind of strange. Surprising resources for kindergarten teachers that are helping them groom the LGBTQ agenda. A lot of really useful stories in there. And then a woman who is suing after transitioning as a teen and did not much care for the results of the sex change operation. We're actually starting to see the backswing, I think, of this trans movement in many ways. So check out The Loop. Again, go to catholicvote.org. They will give you a home screen there where you can just type in your email address and you will get this. So there's a lot of good stories in there, and some of them we cover here and some of them we don't. So be warned as you walk out into the world with their useful stuff. And we're also going to say thanks to Patriot Coolers. Let me pop them up real quickly here. Someone got into it with me over the weekend saying that the coolers are not made in America. That's true. And in many ways, that would be bothersome, except that no steel coolers are made in America. That's not an option. In fact, I'll show you right here. If you look, there's mine sitting right here on my desk. They're not allowed to be made in this country because we have all of this crazy regulation. It doesn't allow them to make what they call, I think, double-walled insulated coolers in the United States. But what they do with the money that they do make, and they are founded in Houston and they work out of Houston, Texas, America, is they give back to veterans and they take care of our podcast. So check them out at patriotcoolers.com. You can use promo code Kyle, K-Y-L-E. Again, promo code Kyle, K-Y-L-E. Gets you 10% off, gets you free shipping over $50. Easy stuff right there. And you can also follow them on social media if you like. Some of you have been tagging them, and I really appreciate that. That's kind of good, fun stuff. And they are at Patriot Coolers with an S on the end of it, Patriot Coolers, on all your social media like Truth and Twitter, where we are. All right. Let's launch into this thing because it gets kind of dark, and it gets pretty dark pretty quickly. Ryan, let's bring up topic number one, and that is going to be the whole idea that America, we actually have our own version of the camps. Now, those of us who have been kind of looking into this sort of thing, who have been seeing COVID tyranny and been concerned about the way that America has been moving forward, have always thought, when are the gulags coming? And that was obviously a Soviet construction. When are the death camps coming? And that was a Nazi German construction. But we have our own version of camps, and many people have forgotten them. It's kind of a footnote in history because FDR was so loved by the leftist press, but we had our own version of camps. And this is, of course, the famous internment camps for Japanese Americans in the 1940s. We're going to get deep into that topic a little bit later on, but I want to just show you that if you'll pop up the graphic here, this is from NPR. And they actually mention that FDR's anecdote to financial collapse, the Great Depression, was in fact one thing: totalitarianism. Totalitarianism was the answer that FDR came up with. And that included a whole bunch of really scary things, not just a movement for putting certain Americans into camps to hold on to them for the remainder of the war. By the way, you only had to be 1/16 Japanese. That's not very much Japanese to be thrown into one of these camps. People like Keanu Reeves would have been in that camp, as far as I can tell. They also got involved in censorship. So there is a historical precedent for a lot of these things on American soil. And of course, FDR was a Democrat, and he is, in fact, the Democrat that Joe Biden probably most looked up to. He was referred to as a transformational type. So I want you guys to just have that in your mind as we move forward. Let's dig into sort of what the stage is that is set in this case. So they started off with a political hit list, and the political hit list is pretty straightforward. There are people that are qualified for the Republican debate. There are 7 of them at this point. And those 7 individuals, I'm going to name them off for you, and then we're going to kind of go over how the left is now going to try to dismantle them one at a time. We've got former President Trump. We've got Ron DeSantis. We've got Vivek Ramaswamy. We've got former Vice President Mike Pence. We have Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, and Chris Christie. All of them qualified for Republican debates. We are looking right now at CNN talking about these people. So this is their hit list. These are the people that they are going to have to take down in order to enact whatever it is they're going to enact. Ryan, if you pull up the Trump indictment page from the Los Angeles Times, we know that the first piece is we're going to deal with President Trump. He's obviously the front runner in the Republican primary. So what do you do with Trump? We've already seen some of it. We've seen that he could be indicted now for January 6th, but let's step back a ways. Alvin Bragg in New York, state charges. A possible grand jury in Georgia, more state charges. The Mar-a-Lago raid and the indictment over there, over 37 counts under the Espionage Act. That's in Florida. That's going to be difficult for them to prove because it's Florida. So we need more. And the last one here is there's the expectation that he's going to be indicted over January 6th stuff. Not enough evidence. What do they say here? There's more than enough evidence convict. This is an opinion piece in the Los Angeles Times. They are going to start moving forward, normalizing the idea that, of course, President Trump could be convicted on this because there's plenty of evidence that he's the problem. Even though many of us saw, both in real time and over the last couple of years after this, that he was asking for people to peaceably make their voice heard, that the breach of the Capitol happened before he finished his speech, and a bunch of other things. They started this censorship routine. They pulled his voice from Twitter, where he had such a massive following and was able to speak directly to the American people. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this article. I want you to get, again, it's what they say and how they say it is always so important. Donald Trump announced that he's been notified that he's a target of the special counsel investigation into the events of January 6th. This is obviously different than the Espionage Act. This is different than the classified documents that were going on. Okay. And so what they said is that the suspected crimes against the Constitution and the nation is this sort of seditious conspiracy. That's actually why they had to go after all the other guys first. They had to get the Oath Keepers. They had to get the Proud Boys. They had to get all these January 6 people. They have to have hundreds now, and they're working on getting over 1,000 convictions in order to show there's this huge pattern of facts, and that the overarching and the overwhelming, mover that made all these things happen on that day was in fact Donald Trump. They've got to kick him out of the race because he's the top guy. All right. The next one, if you want to pull up the Washington Post, they're talking about the same exact thing. It says, even as a third indictment looms, many Americans and many Republicans, rather, stand by Trump. Okay, so there's a story about in Iowa. They're talking about people that still think that even though he's abrasive and offensive and sometimes looks orange, she's still all in for Donald Trump for a third term. They've got all these voters that still look at Donald Trump as being wronged in many ways, wronged by a administrative state that went after him for so long, and Americans kind of like an underdog. And even though Donald Trump is the former president, he's fighting an uphill battle, right? So they've got to go out there and talk about who these people are, that they are all ignorant. If you are a Trump supporter, obviously you're still in that same category of deplorable that Hillary Clinton talked about. You are not a person that is appropriate for polite conversation. We talked about some of the dehumanizing language. This is very important stuff, so they can go ahead and eliminate the support for Donald Trump. He's the top guy. They've got to take him out before anybody else. And we kind of looked like they were propping up Ron DeSantis for a little bit. It actually looked like they were using them and pitting them against each other. There's nothing better than having a party divided amongst two people. If they can go out there and sort of balkanize, which is to say, break them into factions and let the infighting happen. And if any of you are watching what goes on in social media, particularly on Twitter, the back and forth, the ugly rhetoric that happens between Trump supporters and DeSantis supporters. Many of you thought Ron DeSantis did a great job during COVID. Many people who live in Florida thought he was an outstanding governor choice. And then the minute that he's running against Trump, now he's a demon again, and he's DeSanctimonious and so on and so forth. I find all of this very, very off-putting as someone who's kind of watching from the sidelines. I don't really care. I'm an anti-Biden guy at this point. I'm not a Republican by any means. But if we can pull up the next article here, which is going to be done in, where did this come from? The New York Times. You'll see that they're actually going to take shots at Ron DeSantis now as well, because once they get him in a place where he is a great rival to Trump, now you got to bring him down too. And so these are all left-wing sources. We've seen Washington Post, we've seen Los Angeles Times, now New York Times, and this article is entitled "The Steep Cost of Ron DeSantis Vaccine Turnabout." Something really interesting happened. I'm gonna switch views here. Something really interesting happened yesterday. I was watching Twitter and I follow this guy named Ted Lieu. Many of you know that he's a congressman from California. Ted Lieu did one of these weird, I don't know what it is, like a troll and a self-own at the same time. What he essentially said is thank God for Donald Trump, who appreciated and understood how important the COVID vaccines were and was able to move forward with Operation Warp Speed. Now, most people are not going to see this leftist Democrat, and he's far left as far as politicians go, this leftist Democrat praising a Donald Trump. So we have to look at, why is that happening? And it's happening because so many people who also love Donald Trump want nothing to do with these COVID vaccines. And so he's tying Trump inexplicably to Operation Warp Speed and the things that were done in the name of COVID at the end of his presidency. And honestly, that's a reasonable question for those of us who want to know who the best candidate is. That's something that Donald Trump should answer for. But the idea that a leftist Democrat is going to be tying it to him, that is obviously something else going on, because they are not trying to bolster support for Donald Trump. They're actually trying to fractionalize it. And then he says something that I think is the cell phone part of it, which is that he said, go out and make sure you get your children vaccinated for COVID. Go out and make sure you talk to your pediatrician. That was a specific thing. Go to your APA approved pediatrician and get them to make sure that your kid has bought in. So they're trying to, go out there and convert the youth. As usual, we expect them to go after your children. That's the nature of the political left. But the fact that he is using this lead in, and there were millions of people that saw this tweet, by the way. So this was a large distribution from this guy. Even though he has a pretty good following, this was pretty well received all the way across the board. And people are pushing back. And he said, fact check me. Community note me, which is what Twitter does for fact checks. Check in and see, and say if there's anything that's false about what I said. Well, number one, I think he's correct. I think that Donald Trump's administration is responsible for Warp Speed, did push out the shots. The key, and this is the thing that they are highlighting they're highlighting one piece of it and they're ignoring the other piece of it. What Donald Trump did not do was mandate it, did not use the tactics of totalitarianism. We had to wait until President Biden got in to see that. And I'm a victim of that totalitarianism. That I was a federal employee who was told under no uncertain terms that I had to get this. Many of you had that same experience working for private industry. And in fact, there was actually just a vote in Congress that didn't pass where they were looking to mandate that people who lost their jobs over COVID vax mandates in airlines specifically would get their jobs back. And it didn't pass. And it was bipartisan. You should know that. There are many Republicans who voted against the bill that would have reinstated pilots and stewardesses and flight mechanics and so on that didn't want to get the shots. And there were thousands of people in that industry, in the transportation industry, that lost their jobs over this. Just worth noting, the mandates only happened under Biden. And that's the thing to really focus on if you are a conservative or if you are a Republican, capital R, is that mandates happened only under Democrats, and they suddenly wanted to take credit for all the work that went on under President Trump's regime. Now, say what you like about the shots. Say what you like about government programs rushing shots. And I'm not a big fan of those things. But what I do know is they weren't forced down your throats. It takes a leftist totalitarian to do that. And as I said, there's a fantastic playbook that we're going to look into from the late 1930s, moving on into the 50s under FDR and under Truman, because a lot of this stuff actually goes that far back. All right. So we'll continue on. As I said, Ron DeSantis, now they're going to highlight the number of COVID deaths and the number of things that were going on in Florida during the time when he was basically keeping Florida open for business. They of course, cherry pick their data. That is the nature of the New York Times. They don't have to be honest operators. So they talk about vaccination rates. There's some graphs on here. If you guys want to go, you can actually check out the archive and go look for this article, which is a front page as of yesterday. And they're talking about how, there were all these people over the age of 65 and they had a really good rate. They were 15% more vaccinated in older Floridians than there were in the national average. And so that was really great. And then he turned the corner and he decided not to be involved in this stuff. And when that happened, suddenly all these residents started dying at a higher rate. And when adjusted for age, it says basically more people died than any other state during the Delta wave. But here's the thing. Floridians are a pretty old group. As a state, it has a ton of people that come in their retirement age because they have advantageous retirement laws financially. And so people leave places like New York and New Jersey and so on. They leave Connecticut and they go and they retire in Florida where it's warm and it's nice and they had a lot of freedom. And these people, some of them were older and in bad health. And a lot of people die in Florida anyway, because that's where people, in many ways, woke may go to die there, but also a lot of people in America go to die there. That's where they go and retire, and they go, and it's the natural cause of age. So they went into these weekly notices of how many people were dying, and they basically want to point out that Ron DeSantis is the worst, even though we can see that his overall death rate was much lower than the national average in early May of 23, and then they're going to try to act like he did something terrible. So they've gone on a hit against Donald Trump. They've gone on a hit against Ron DeSantis. And so who's next? How about Mike Pence? Mike Pence is guilty of an article here that we've got from CNN. And the article says that he's not convinced that Trump's actions were criminal on January 6th. Well, that is a big no-no, because when we have fear, we have to kind of divide people along these lines. We talked about the American Rorschach test much earlier in this podcast. We've had several guests that were actually at January 6th. And the nuanced view of it is essentially a protest turned into riot. I think that's the most reasonable version of it. And I think Pence probably understands that that's the only way that you get anybody to support you in the Republican Party right now. You can't talk about it being seditionist, treasonous, insurrectionist, whatever emotional words the left has. And so they've got to basically smear him as well. He is not part of the J6 orthodoxy. Okay. He's not talking about the things that need to be talked about in order to get support by the left. And he's never going to be supported by the left, but he is kind of an old school Republican politician, kind of the neocon version, right? So he's not convinced that Donald Trump is a criminal, and that means he must be thrown out, and that's going to be okay to attack him because of that. He has to be attacked because he just doesn't have the juice. And then the last one, and the rest of those, by the way, Vivek is kind of interesting. He's got some ties that people have pointed out to Soros for a fellowship he got, and he had some tweets deleted, and they've pointed out on the right, people on our, like I'd say, generally conservative side have pointed out some of the things that he's done, tying him to COVID statements they didn't like and so on. Once again, I don't think he ever supported a mandate. And I don't think he was supportive of the Biden administration mandating things, but he's got some strikes in his corner and he's a much smaller candidate. The rest of them are sort of negligible. Nikki Haley, I think, is dead on arrival. She's not a serious candidate in any way that's going to make anything. Chris Christie's on there. We see Tim Scott, who may make a good VP candidate, but is not going to lead the ticket. So all those people, the top contenders, had to be dealt with, and they have been. And I got a bonus one for you. Who is the next biggest threat to a Joe Biden administration? Let's pull that one up real quick. We've got a fact check of RFK. Now, we just talked about him on Friday. We went deep into the fact that RFK is he's a guy who is called for caution in regards to COVID vaccines. And so what do we have? We've got CNN here. This is their politics section. The politics section, not public health, by the way, politics, says fact check. RFK Jr. claimed that he's never told people to avoid vaccination, but he did less than 2 years ago. That was in 2021. Many of us will remember what was going on in 2021, that we were in the middle of this mandates coming down the park. And one of the things, if you actually look at what he says, I guarantee you that if he was a right winger, they would have said something to the effect of it lacks context. But what they said, let's just quote directly from him. Kennedy was a witness on Thursday's hearing. That was last week, led by the Republican House Judiciary Committee on the supposed weaponization. I like supposed weaponization, by the way. There's no question the government has been weaponized. But you got to have CNN opining in here. They're not even calling this an opinion piece, even though it is. So anyway, the supposed weaponization. Sorry, I lost my train of thought when I started thinking about them just overwhelmingly trying to push their narratives. It doesn't matter how they do it, and they have to discredit everybody left and right when they do so. So the supposed weaponization of the federal government, he claimed in his testimony that he's never been anti-vax, that he's up to date on all his vaccinations except for his refusal of COVID-19 shots. Probably like many of you. Many of you have also gotten all of the required, quote unquote, required vaccinations. And the quote that they're going to hone in on here is that he's never told the public, quote, I have never told the public, avoid vaccination, end quote. And then he talks about his children and so on and so forth. So those of you who watched the hearing already know RFK basically said, I'm just urging caution. So now they got to go back and find something that he said on a podcast for Health Freedom for Humanity in 2021, a podcast that I've never heard of, but maybe a lot of you have. And he was talking about how parents should respond to the CDC's schedule of immunizations, which, by the way, was trying to add the COVID immunization in. And his questioner, the person who was hosting the podcast, said that the schedule was actually insane. The issue that a lot of people have too, and I've heard RFK say this over and over, is that young children, like babies, day-old babies, are getting vaccinated against things like STDs that they don't have any possibility of getting. I actually found out, because my wife and I are going to have a baby very soon, some of the things that you just assume are regular care and treatment in the hospital are not really, they don't really make a lot of sense. You've seen the goop that they smear in the eyes, the antibiotic little ointments. I didn't know why they did that. I've been a paramedic and I'm actually fairly medically educated. I'm pretty well aware of what goes on. The reason that they did that was because of the possibility of the baby getting either chlamydia or gonorrhea in their eyes, sexually transmitted diseases. Just put that in your mind for a second again. Sexually transmitted diseases in their eyes, which would mean that, in fact, the mother, in fact, was passing that vaginally to the baby as they're born. How much sense does that make? Does it make any sense whatsoever? It's just a government protocol. And it was actually passed in Texas. There was a law passed something like almost 100 years ago. And we had our midwife describe it to us. And I went like, oh, okay, well, we don't need that. That's silly. And yet everybody thinks that's a standard of care. We're reading through some of these books about birth, and just the expectation of healthcare and sick care is so strange, because only 100 years ago, all the ideas of being born in a hospital would never have existed. It's all modern stuff. And we all think that you're supposed to have a baby laying in a hospital bed, and that's the way it's always been. But it's not. I mean, women had babies in caves. So the idea that you would start shoving them full of vaccines on their first couple of days in the world when they're not exposed to anything, and they have that 6-month sort of breastfed immunity time, very strange. And I think RFK is basically just highlighting in on these things. So he said that he has encouraged people to join him in telling strangers not to vaccinate their baby. He says, quote, for many, many years, I think parents were so gaslighted. They were so scapegoated. They were so vilified and marginalized. He's talking about parents that didn't get their kids vaccinated either ever or right away, which I think is actually a fully reasonable thing to say. Wait until they're a little bit bigger. These shots are enormous compared to the size of the baby, like when it comes to the amount of dose per weight. He says even parents of kids who were very, very badly injured, they knew what happened to their kids, but they were reluctant to talk about it. He's talking about vaccine injured kids. There's the whole thing about autism. There's the thing about whether or not it has any connection to vaccines. I've heard him argue very credibly that the studies were set up in false pretense, that the studies basically said, there's this derivative of mercury that exists in all these different types of vaccines as a preservative, and they basically test for it a week later and it's not in the bloodstream, so they say it's fine. But it also has a home in fatty tissues, and the brain is full of those. So that's his argument, that is the possibility, and we just don't have enough studies on it to prove one conclusively or the other. Interesting point. I just think it's worth arguing those things. If we're going to be a society that is free, if we're going to be a society that doesn't have censorship, then we should be able to at least have those conversations. But of course, he was not. So they're trying to censor him again. He says, this is Kennedy again, quoted in this article again, kind of a hit piece on him, saying, if you're one of 10 people that goes up to a guy, a man or a woman who's been carrying around a baby, like imagine in a park, and says, don't vaccinate your baby, and they hear that from 10 others, they'll make that impression on them. But we've all kept our mouth shut, so don't shut your mouth anymore. So that's what they're saying. RFK is a vaccine denier and potentially a liar, because of course he went in front of Congress and he had that piece. Now, the scary thing is this. They've basically tried to marginalize the positions of all these people. They want to get rid of RFK. They want to get rid of Trump. They want to get rid of Vivek. They want to get rid of the DeSantis. And so who is the answer? The answer is an old man tripped by sandbags who has a struggle getting up and down the stairs. So I've got a video for you here. We didn't play this earlier, so let's cue up video number 1. I want you to kind of think. We always, like I said, our head always goes towards Nazis, and this is obviously the imagery of that. Look at the fact that they blame conservatives for this, and then tell me how much of this stuff was actually enacted by conservatives. Ryan, if you want to roll video 1 real quick, this is a great clip from the movie V for Vendetta. Go ahead and roll it.
Our story begins, as these stories often do, with a young up-and-coming politician. He's a deeply religious man and a member of the Conservative Party. He's completely single-minded and has no regard for the political process. The more power he attains, the more obvious his zealotry and the more aggressive his supporters become. Eventually, his party launches a special project in the name of national security. At first, it's believed to be a search for biological weapons, and it's pursued without regard to its cost. However, the true goal of this project is power, complete and total hegemonic domination. The project, however, ends violently. But the efforts of those involved are not in vain, for a new ability to wage war is born from the blood of one of the victims. Imagine a virus, the most terrifying virus you can, and then imagine that you and you alone have the cure. But if your ultimate goal is power, how best to use such a weapon? It's at this point in our story that along comes a spider. He is a man seemingly without a conscience, for whom the ends always justify the means, and it is he who suggests that their target should not be an enemy of the country, but rather the country itself. 3 targets are chosen to maximize the effect of the attack: a school, a tube station, and a water treatment plant. Several hundred die within the first few weeks.
That Three Waters has, in fact, been contaminated.
Authorities are attempting to control its deadly spread.
Sent a wave of destruction throughout the underground.
Fueled by the media, fear and panic spread quickly, fracturing and dividing the country until at last the true goal comes into view. Before the St. Mary's crisis, no one would have predicted the results of the election that year, no one. And then not long after the election, lo and behold, a miracle. Some believed it was the work of God himself, but it was a pharmaceutical company controlled by certain party members that made them all obscenely rich. A year later, several extremists are tried, found guilty and executed, while a memorial is built to canonize their victims. But the end result, the true genius of the plan, was the fear. Fear became the ultimate tool of this government, and through it, our politician was ultimately appointed to the newly created position of High Chancellor. The rest, as they say, is history.
Can you prove any of this?
Why do you think I'm still alive?
All right. We'd like to take you into protective custody, Mr. Rookwood.
Oh, I'm sure you would. But if you want that recording, you'll do what I tell you to do. You put Creedy under 24-hour surveillance. When I feel safe that he can't pick his nose without you knowing, I'll contact you again. Till then.
All right, let's go ahead and kill it right
Cheerio.
there. So that movie is V for Vendetta. Many of you guys have seen that movie. And in many ways, it's prophetic. It was before all of these things, but they've honed in on some of the tools of totalitarianism, and they are fear, and they are a divided nation, and we are dealing with a lot of those things in different ways. What's funny to me is just like movies that are dystopian, like Escape from LA, the John Carpenter flick that goes back a long ways as well, another 20 years back. We're talking about something that is it's the exact opposite of what happens in reality, right? They think that we are going to be dealing with a regime, a fascist regime, a right-wing totalitarian regime that's going to get rid of artists and homosexuals and people who love things that are beautiful. And that's what is going on in V for Vendetta, by the way. That's who they get. It's homosexual partners are black bagged and thrown away. We've got people who are, creative types, the people in the media that actually just want to stand for freedom and building these beautiful institutions or stories and things like that. And that's not what's going on. The media is actually all in on this stuff. I mean, think about it. Hollywood loves to cast themselves as the victim and also as the heroes in these films. And yet the real kind of scary stuff comes out of leftism. If we can pull up what's going on right now with our dear friend, President Biden, will you bring up number 2, the video number 2 here? This is people who I actually loathe in many ways. This is Mika Brzezinski and her husband, Joe Scarborough, an alleged Republican. This is a video that goes back quite a ways. We went back a couple of years. This is at the beginning of the Biden presidency. And what you'll see here is this is what they expected Joe Biden to bring them. Go ahead and roll that video.
It's been so fascinating because Biden, everybody was saying he's going to be like FDR, or maybe I'd said maybe there were some Truman parallels, but he may be turning into a transformational president, and a lot like Reagan, who always got underestimated going to the White House, in part because, Reagan said things like trees cause more pollution than cars. And
Sure.
People would hang signs around trees that say, "Stop me before I kill again." Biden's always been underestimated, but I really do sense that we are moving into a post-Reagan era. I think, we had the FDR, sort of the FDR era from 32 to 80, and then the Reagan era from 80 to maybe 2020. But this feels really different. I mean, 75% of Americans are supporting pretty huge, pretty expansive government relief bills. It feels like we're moving into sort of a new era.
Those two are so detestable in so many ways.
That's so bad.
It's gross, right? It just makes you like your skin crawl. So you sit there and you think, okay, he claims that the FDR era goes from his original election in the early, 1933? Is that when his first election was? I actually got the timeline up here. So FDR elected 1933 or took office in 1933, and then essentially carries on until 1945 with his 3 terms. And then we've also got the following terms, which were his vice president, Harry Truman, kind of followed on. I think that was actually the plan here. In 2008, we expected an Obama, then we expected Obama again, then some Hillary, and they ended up putting Joe Biden in, who is kind of like a wannabe, a wannabe Truman. So we've got this sort of idea that we're going to do this transformational piece. And if you remember, during the first 100 days, that was the New Deal. The New Deal legislation that went through in the United States happened in the beginning of FDR's term. He was combating the Great Depression, this huge economic woe, and you've got to basically get everybody on board. You've got to divide the country up to the point where they're going to be able to move along with your agenda. And the original talk about expanding the court, which we're hearing a bunch of banging on about right now, expanding the Supreme Court, that was an FDR move, right? The idea that we were going to expand government in this big way, FDR in a big way. Then the last thing that really troubles me is in 1946 under Truman, we had the Administrative Procedures Act, which really was the founding of the American deep state. This was the idea that you were going to take powers away from Congress and give them to the executive branch. And these executive agencies would essentially be the quote unquote trust the experts type thing, where they were going to run and do their own rules. Okay. They were not going to have to go to Congress. Congress would give them sort of the mandate, establish the agency and the funding, and then they would decide the best ways to do it. And when you do that long enough, you end up with things like the ATF knocking on your door saying that a product that they said was safe and legal and within the law is now no longer within the law, and they're going to go do it arbitrarily. So that's all really scary stuff. But the tools that I've kind of identified are racism, fear, and fear is the COVID stuff right now, and then economics, the economic divide. And they're going to use all 3 of those tools in order to institute the same sort of totalitarianism that we've been seeing for quite a long time. So let's bring up the article here. This is the Biden, the new little piece about Biden that says we are going to establish a national monument this week honoring Emmett Till. That's from this weekend, so it's actually about this week. And Biden is going to just set up this space, some of the hallowed grounds that Emmett Till walked in his very short life. Now, some of you may not know the story of Emmett Till, so I'm going to rehash it in kind of a short and easy way. But Emmett Till was a young boy who was apparently from Chicago. I think he was 14 years old. He was visiting family members that he had in Mississippi. Okay. And this is at the height of the sort of the lynchings and the nasty power that was going on. This is during that era. Like I said, we go all the way until 1953. So it was just in the beginning of the Eisenhower era, right after we had that sort of little swing back towards the Republican side. And in 1955, he was killed brutally and just disgustingly. It's a story that the FBI investigated under their charge to go after the Klan and some of the racist things that were happening in the South. And so we now have the White House putting out an official statement saying the new monument will protect places that tell the story of Emmett Till's too short life and racially motivated murder, the unjust acquittal of his murderers, and that happened, and the activism of his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, who courageously brought the world's attention to the brutal injustices and racism of the time, catalyzing the civil rights movement. So we've got to do racism. We've got to do it again. And if you remember, one of the things that we just celebrated in June was this day, Juneteenth. And I'll tell you why I think it sits badly with people who are on the political right. I don't think anybody on the political right has a problem with celebrating the life of Emmett Till, who was taken from this world at a very young age through some brutal acts of disgusting racists in the South. And I don't think anybody has a problem with celebrating Juneteenth as a day, as a concept of notifying slaves in places like Texas, because it's a celebration of what happened in Galveston 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Nobody hates the idea of that happening, where we celebrate a day knowing that the slaves were freed. Here's the problems. We have a Democrat president who is using them to divide. Why are we doing them in 2021? And why are we choosing those days as opposed to celebrating, let's say, the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued by Lincoln, who was a Republican? That's why. Why are we talking about Emmett Till now on a man who basically was I guess Emmett Till would have been 82 years old this year on his birthday, which is what they're announcing this on. This is all political timing, of course. He's roughly Biden. He would have been roughly Biden's age. So Biden actually grew up in the era when this stuff went on, and he was a kid. He was 14. He was 12 years old when Emmett, Till was killed, and he served with all these sort of racists and old school leftists and old school Klansmen types that were in the House and the Senate and so on. So Biden's whole shtick is not that he is so anti-racist. He's just whatever the party needs at the time, and I think that's why it relates back to that the operational morality of V for Vendetta, that video that we just looked at. Biden is not any of these things, I don't think. I don't think he feels very strongly about them, in the same way that I don't believe that an 80-year-old man in this country like Joe Biden actually in his heart of hearts thinks that men can transform themselves magically into women and vice versa, or that we should have topless trannies at the White House, jiggling their male boobs and all this kind of stuff. All that stuff is bizarre. It doesn't make any sense for a man that age. And yet, I would say that he is doing so specifically because it's what the party requires of him to divide this nation further. And that is the tool that they're going to be using. So the second thing we see, racism is one. COVID fear, which of course they mentioned in that documentary, or not documentary, in the movie, which is fiction. If you'll bring up topic number 11, that's going to be our story that we just found out. Michigan State University was just now affirmed in Lansing, Michigan, that they can in fact require all faculty and staff to be vaccinated against COVID. So this is a appeals circuit. This is in the 6th Circuit of Appeals out of Cincinnati. They ruled 3-0 in favor of this university, which is a public university and gets public funding as well as government funding, that they in fact can apply this and require that all staff and all students be vaccinated against COVID-19. Now, there's this tricky history going on right now of whether or not COVID-19 vaccine mandates are legal, whether they make any sense. And I've been part of this group called Feds for Medical Freedom that actually got an NBank confirmation of injunction against the Biden administration. Thanks for that, Brian. That's troubling. They've got this NBank review that has basically said that the vaccine mandate is not lawful and is likely unconstitutional for federal workers. But now we've got a disagreeing opinion. And so we're going to actually see this go. It's been appealed by the Biden administration to the Supreme Court. They are trying to continue keeping this thing forward because they need to be able to keep this issue forward. Even though they've withdrawn the vax mandate for federal employees, and therefore the actual decision could be moot, they're not going to let it go. They're not going to let it fall off. That's really scary stuff because they are not necessarily ideologically inclined. They are simply holding these dividing tools more importantly than the actual message that those tools engage in. And maybe here's the last one and the scariest thing. I'm going to bring Ryan in because he and I talk about this kind of stuff off the air on a regular basis. Ryan, would you come in and talk about the economic tool that's being used? And this was actually the original setup for FDR's sort of takeover. The Great Depression equals totalitarianism. We are looking at some pretty bad indicators, and you've been following some of them. So I want you to kind of comment on them.
Yeah, sure. Let me jump in here for a minute. So the first thing I want to point out is the massive amount of credit card debt that Americans are holding. It's $986 billion to be exact. And just to kind of throw that on a chart so you can see that the amount of credit card debt in American history, that it's pretty much always been timed with a Great Depression. We see in 2008, we see the 2020 liquidity crisis, and we see credit card debt now reaching an all-time high. And then if we want to jump in and actually break that down by state, I brought up this chart here. So it actually shows us what states and the average credit card debt per capita. So if you're living in Connecticut, for example, the average credit card balance, the average, so that's not even talking about the max, just the average is $9,408. New York, $9,165. New Jersey, Rhode Island, we get down to Texas, $8,701. Florida, $8,000. I mean, I don't know how some people live with a credit card balance that is that high. And then if we take that a step further and we just talk about on average across the United States right now, the average credit card balance is $7,279. And we're talking about credit card balances. Now you're wondering like, okay, are people paying those balances off every month or are we carrying those balances over? Now, if we jump into this next graphic that I got here on the chart, it actually shows us what percentage of credit card accounts carry a balance. So if we look at the orange section here, if you guys are looking at the screen, you can see that it says 23% had a credit card but don't use it. 34%, which is the blue section here, use a card but never carried a balance. And then the green area, 43% carried a balance at some point. That means that many Americans are rolling over and paying interest on these credit cards. Now, the next question you're going to ask yourself is, well, how much interest are they paying on their credit cards? Great question. The average APR, and this is what blows my mind. So if we just scaled that down from 7,000 down to 5,000, and we say right now, the average APR is 20.6%. So if you have a balance of $5,000 and you're rolling that over, that means that every month you're paying $1,000 in interest just off the top. Now, if we take a look at where that is going, so for cards accruing interest, the average in the second quarter of 2023 was 22.16%. Now, for new credit card offers, the average today is 24.24%, and that is the highest since they began tracking these rates in monthly changes from 2019. And I can say that for certain. Before 2019, there were never credit card balances that were higher than 24.24%. I can guarantee you that. So pretty much from the beginning of time, credit card balances are at an all-time high. Now, what else they're not talking about, and nobody seems to be talking about, is the fact that a lot of people do what are called like the 0% interest credit cards. Now, Visa, MasterCard, and I believe American Express are getting ready to wipe that off. I think it starts in October that unless you have basically like prestige credit, you're not going to be able to get a new credit card with a 0% interest rate. And then what also is going to happen in October is the student loans are going to kick back in. And I want to say it's $7 billion a month. I think it's $465 billion in total student loan debt that's acquired in the United States. And I think those monthly payments are about $7 billion a month divided across all people. I think on the average, it's like $100 to $200 a month you're going to be having to pay on top of already paying your credit cards, which now if we take a look at how many Americans are delinquent on their credit cards, this is an interesting number, but not at an alarming high rate in any sense of the way, but it is going up. We can see that on the last little trajectory there. And I want to say that stopped in Q1 of 2023. So we don't even have the most recent data. And that's where you really start to ask yourself about like how accurate are these charts? What type of data are they hiding from us? If we take a look at the average auto loan right now, the average auto loan balance grew by 7.7% in 2022. So that means the average American right now is paying 7.7% more just for their auto loan balance. You're thinking, how are people going to keep up with this? How much longer can our economy keep going? And this is the chart that I think should blow everybody's mind the most. And this is our chart about search terms. So we talk about search terms, and we talked about pawn shop near me trending at an all-time high in the last 5 years. All-time high. And if we see the chart where I have two, you can see like the graph there where it peaked, would it be like 2019? That was when interest rates hit 3.5%. So every time interest rates go up, the interest that you're paying on your debt gets more expensive. So people have to take out more debt. They have to take out more loans just to keep up and pay on that interest. And we can see right now, right here, and especially in the state of Texas, pawn shop near me is trending at an all-time high. So I always think to myself, why would somebody be searching pawn shop near me? I would say that you have exhausted all resources. Your credit cards are maxed out, you're behind on debt, and you're literally willing to pawn off anything to your name just to get enough money to keep your head above water and put food on your table. And I got two more I want to show you here.
Before you do that, Ryan, let me ask you one quick question. What led you to search for the pawn shop, this pawn shop search? How did you decide that was going to be a relevant metric? Was that something you read somewhere?
I was watching another YouTuber and his videos, and he was talking about trending terms, and he mentioned something about pawn shops. So I got on here and I was like, oh, pawn shops near me. And it just boom, and it hit. I was trying to do more like bankruptcy filed or how to file bankruptcy. I was trying to see if there were any other correlations today before we got on, but I ran out of time.
No, but it's something that we'll keep you posted on this, because it's something that Ryan has told me about before, guys. It's just I'd never thought of it before as an instinct, and I think you're right that the desperation that has to happen when you start searching for pawn shops around you is much higher than some of the other options. All right, finish out that graph. This is all fascinating to me, by the way.
So in this article, the total auto debt climbs to 1.41 trillion. The average auto loan balance grew by 7.7%. The rate of auto delinquencies is rising in 2022. Auto balances rise across all credit score ranges, and increasing auto balances are the largest in California and New Jersey, and Generation X carries the largest auto loan default rate or auto loan balance. Now, this is the one that really blew my mind. So low-income households are falling behind on car payments. So this means the amount of low-income households, which I assume are most people watching this stream, myself included, like I don't make over $100,000 a year, or 150, whatever it has to be to put you above that category. And if we see in normal times, 2019, 2021, the average is about between 2 and about 5.5%, 6%. We can see from December of 2022 to January of 2023, this thing took off like a rocket. We went from about 2.7% all the way to 6.5%, which is now the highest auto loan default rate that we've had since the 2008 financial crisis. And what's more interesting about this is they stopped putting out this data. If anybody can find me an updated chart on this, please tag me, share it over with me on Twitter. I think these statistics are so bad that they're literally no longer putting out this chart because it's accelerating at faster than it was during the 2008 crisis. And that's a wrap on that, Kyle. I'll let you jump back over and take over.
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate what he just said, is that the default rate on auto loans, which is the thing that people are going to need to be able to do their jobs, to be able to just enact their, to run their businesses, it's almost impossible in this country, in most places, to get around without a vehicle. There's a couple places you can do it. You can do it in New York. You can do it in some of the East Coast cities. But almost all small businesses run with an automobile, and almost everybody who is living in most of America is living with their own personal automobile. If you're defaulting on that, and if it's getting taken away, then you are in such dire straits that the means of production for your own income is going to be marginalized and or gone. And so we've talked about these three tools. I think they're all there. They're all available to us. And we're seeing worse numbers, as Ryan just pointed out, than there was in 2008 with the housing crisis. I think the housing is actually being artificially propped up right now. We've got this racism, which is sort of a cultural issue. We've got COVID and fear, which is the public health crisis, which is a lot like we saw in this V for Vendetta piece. And then you've got the economics, which we've had before. This is a perfect storm of three really, really dangerous things. A cultural war that is being pushed, right? And showing that one side is the villain and that the other side is a hero. And that hero is Joe Biden right now, apparently. by naming these racial things. And there's a whole bunch of other examples of it. You guys can go back in and see it. And we end up with this guy who's out in front of the red steps of Constitution Hall and banging his fist with the Marines behind him, the red speech that we saw last year, and some of these other sort of images. The question is, are we really trying to run down the line of a USSR? Are we trying to run down the line of a Germany? Or are we trying to run down the line of an FDR, which Joe Biden and the people that were kind of hawking Joe Biden to us early on in his presidency have already stated that is his aspirational goal, to be sort of transformative in a way that's pretty scary stuff. So let's bring up this next slide here of FDR. For those of you who have forgotten, this is where we're going with this. That feeling of, are we going to be dealing with camps? Are we going to be dealing with death camps? Are we going to deal with gulags and forced labor and so on? This article is entitled Saving Face, Remembering Executive Order 9066. And this was implemented in April of 1942. It was actually signed, I think, in February 19th of 1942, but was started to be implemented across the country over the next 60 days, where they rounded up Asian Americans of Japanese descent. They took 120,000 people in 1942 and put them in internment camps, which is a nice way of saying that they were put in prison for the crime of being Japanese after the Japanese mainland attacked an island base at Pearl Harbor. And so there is a blueprint for this sort of thing that has happened historically. This article was written back in 2017. It was the 75th anniversary. So obviously we are now coming up on the 80th anniversary of this thing, 81st anniversary. We've already passed that, I guess. 80 plus years. This was the background that Joe Biden grew up in. He's 80 years old. And so this was happening right when he was a child. And this was normalized in many ways that this happened. And then it's been kind of thrown off into the underneath the dustbin of history. It's been thrown under the rug. We talk about all the horrible things that happened in Europe, the horrible things that happened to the kulaks and the farmers in Ukraine and so on. We talk about the atrocities that happened in all these places where they got rid of the intellectuals, whether it be in the Chinese, the Cultural Revolution, or we talk about the USSR, we talk about the Germans and so on. We go all the way down the list. I never hear FDR's name thrown into the pile of totalitarians that decided to imprison their own people simply out of fear or trying to get public sentiment on their side using these tools. And that scares the crap out of me, to be honest. There is another thing that many of us don't know, and I wanted to highlight it today. In 1941, just after Pearl Harbor, about 11 days afterwards, 2 weeks after the strike on Pearl Harbor, we had an executive order 8985 that predated the one I just talked about. 8985 was the establishment of the Office of Censorship. Can you pull that one up for me too, Ryan? The Office of Censorship, which was an office that used voluntary compliance with the press in order to censor information that would be negative to the American war effort. It's your patriotic duty to listen to what the government has to say and to keep the negative stories or the stories about the wartime effort under wraps. This is where the old expression "loose lips sink ships" idea came out. It wasn't something that was pointed towards Americans. It was pointed towards the American press. Did any of you know that we had an Office of Censorship during World War II? Because I did not until this morning when I started looking into these executive orders and looking what are the tools that these people are using, and they've all been done before. We have a much more sophisticated censorship apparatus than they had by then. And I'm going to kind of read out just the quick pieces here that they created. A Office of Censorship. This goes back, like I said, to December 18th of 1941. There's a head of the directorate. He's called the Director of Censorship. God, this stuff is Orwellian. The Director of Censorship shall cause to be censored in his absolute discretion. Really? Communications by mail, cable, radio, or other means of transmission passing through the United States and any foreign country, which may be carried by any vessel or means of transport touching any port, place, or territory of the United States bound to and from any foreign nation, in accordance with such rules and regulations as the President shall, from time to time, prescribe. We are talking about, can we censor the American press and any means of distribution of information on the say-so of a president based on this office? And then we have things like CISA. And then we have things like the FBI getting involved with our big tech companies. And then we see that the parallels have all been there. There's nothing new under the sun. This has all been done before. This has all always been there. They have just revived it. It doesn't matter whether it's the CIA getting involved in corporate media. It doesn't matter whether it's the FBI going to people at Twitter and Facebook and Google. Censorship has always been a tool of the authoritarians, of the totalitarians. And it turns out, interestingly enough, in American history and most of the history abroad, it's always been on the political left. For all the people want to agitate about the Nazis being, a right-wing organization, because they love to say that, they have the word socialism in there, and they went after communists who were on the left because they were their rivals in that space. They tried to nationalize things. I think all this stuff should give us pause. It's not a good note. It's not a good feeling to think that this is what we are facing down. But we have to be aware that if we are not paying attention to the lessons that those who were attacked in our history, we are doomed to suffer the same fate as those who were interned or attacked during our history. That's the real lesson. That's the lesson we should be taking away from that old adage: those who do not learn their history are doomed to repeat it. I think they are doomed to suffer what those who have already suffered did. And that's my takeaway for today, folks. Hopefully that's not the most debilitating thing that you've heard, but it is not a good note for a Friday. Ryan, did you want to come in here and add something to that?
Yeah, I was wondering if you wanted to do a little Q&A. We had a bunch of people asking some questions in here, and I was going to see if you wanted to stick around for an extra 5 minutes and do a little Q&A at the end of the show.
Yeah, let's do it at the end of the show. Let's wrap up the audio podcast here for all these folks. Folks, if you want to see the Q&A, you can jump onto our Rumble channel. Again, it is streamed live every Monday, Wednesdays, and Friday at 9:30 Eastern, 8:30 here in Texas, America. Streamed live from Liberty Hill, Texas. Don't forget to like the videos. If you are enjoying what you hear, give us a 5-star review on Apple, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and all the other podcast apps that you may be listening to. We do appreciate it. The show continues to grow because of y'all and because of the 5-star reviews like this one. This one is from JAF2F4. I'm pretty sure that actually got butchered by Apple. It says, great podcast, 5 stars. Kyle, I met you back at a dinner with Dinesh. Dinner with Dinesh D'Souza. That limits the number of people it could have been. I've been listening to every episode since May. Keep on fighting the fight and have a fantastic podcast. We really do appreciate that, Jeff. And thanks for listening. Once again, we are over 600 reviews. We'd love to see it up to 1,000 by the end of this year. I think that can be done, and it can be done because you guys go out there and do it. We want to say thanks again to the hard work and the technical skill of Ryan Matta, who you've been seeing working behind the scenes. You can follow Ryan at Ryan Matta Media on Twitter or at Ryan Matta on True Social if you're into that variety. He's got a bunch of great videos that have been posted over the last couple of days. Pieces from the congressional hearing if you missed them. And then our opening theme was composed and performed by my talented brother, Casey Seraphin. Folks, subscribe to the Rumble channel wherever you get your podcast, and we will do this again on Wednesday. We look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much. Let's go ahead and roll that outro, and we will play on the stream for just a little bit longer.
Thanks for listening to The Kyle Seraphin Show, streamed live Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays on rumble.com/Kyle Seraphin. Follow Kyle on Twitter and True Social at Kyle Seraphin.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for the audio podcast, but let's see. What do we got going on in the chat that we need to address?
We got some questions. Why don't you jump over there? I'm going to screenshot some. I'll send them to you over in the actual Telegram or in our Signal chat, and we can just jump right onto it.
Let's do it. Folks, thanks for sticking around. If you're interested, we will take some questions here. I don't know that I have all the answers. I know that I have a lot of fears after waking up with this stuff today. So,
all right, I got first one. So it says, it's me, G. What is the likelihood of these camps happening again, but with America?
Well, here's the problem. This already happened in America, and that's the whole point. The blueprint exists, and it happened under a Democrat like FDR, right? It happened under someone that Joe Biden sees as an inspiration. There is a lot of talk, and that's why I showed you that Mika Brzezinski and the Scarborough clip. The talk was essentially that they thought he was going to be the next FDR, that they were going to push another New Deal, and that his infrastructure plan and the relief of debt for Americans, they were going to take all the sort of tools of financial unrest and they were going to use them to implement this social change. Will it happen? It better not happen. The only upside is that we have a First and a Second Amendment in this country. And I think that's the danger of the censorship offices and the relationship that we've had revealed through the Twitter files and some others. Missouri v. Biden. So for those of you that are following our friend Tracy Beans, you already know this stuff. The idea that they want to censor what's between your ears and the so-called cognitive infrastructure, what you think, it's all very real. The path has been laid out and they're still marching down it. So aware makes you forearmed against the possibility that they try to implement this stuff. But as my buddy said the other day, he said it on True Social, I believe this was Phil Kennedy. He mentioned that many members of the federal government would happily shove people into boxcars because they're keeping They're keeping those superior orders is what it's called. That's the defense, or the just following orders defense from Nuremberg. It didn't fly then, but there's a reason why everyone did it. It's because people are vested in doing what they were doing and maintaining the status quo. So we have to be aware of it. We have to be aware of the lessons that history had out there. And, in some ways it's terrifying, but it's also empowering to know that it existed. We know it, and we have to resist it. What do you got?
Next up, Eric says, can the general public sue Biden or the government over all of this? Or is this something that's not even plausible?
Here's the really crazy thing about suing the federal government. They have what's called qualified immunity. It's why if you were theoretically a federal law enforcement officer and you are facing a civil suit, then what they will do is they will make it a federal case and then they will dismiss it through qualified immunity. So in many ways, no, you cannot sue the government because it represents you. It's kind of a funny little argument because in some ways there shouldn't actually be public sector unions because of this too. Some of these things don't make any sense at all. We have such a patchwork quilt of this information. It's actually scary stuff. But generally speaking, we can sue to stop policies. You can ask for injunctions in federal court. But that's the fun thing about what they've been doing with this lawfare. They are pushing forward agendas and they are making us fight. We're always on the back foot of it. I have Saul Alinsky's Rule for Radicals. I actually pulled it up here because I wanted to be able to read from it. And this is the reason why I think this is most important. Rule number 1, power is not what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. If the enemy, and that's us in this case, compared to what these guys are doing, as I said, they've carved off an enemy. If we think that they have the ability to do this and allow it, then in fact, they do have that power. And so that's the reason why we have to be forewarned. Rule number 1, and it's the most basic rule from Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. And if you don't know, that's the playbook that these people have been working off. They've been doing it for a long time. What else we got?
Next up, it says Della Meow. When Democrats lock up conservatives, can they seize their homes and give them to illegal aliens?
No, not directly. But they can seize things like that. So if you've gone back and watched we had a whole episode with Amy Nelson. There's a process the federal government uses that's called civil asset forfeiture. And so if they can argue that your property was involved in a crime, they don't even have to prove that you did the crime or that there was even the crime was even committed using your property. They simply go after it and seize it. And you're on the back end trying to defend your property with your own money, which they've actually taken. So you're going to be far more limited. It's one of the most unfair and most sort of anti-constitutional things that we have in the American system, the idea of civil asset forfeiture. It's one of those things I would actually get rid of in a heartbeat. Things like that, the unlawful spying. There's a handful of these things that are just scary. They've grown up. They've become normal. They were tools for fighting a real evil. Civil asset forfeiture was used to go after organized crime and try to make sure that crime was not profitable. We see that, in fact, it is, of course, and the people who have money like that are able to fight and get their stuff back, or they just let it go. It's part of the cost of doing business. But as far as giving them directly to illegal aliens, I don't think that there's any mechanism to make that happen. Though we are seeing more and more. In fact, we're going to be doing an interview this afternoon, Ryan and I will, with a guy who was basically using federal government dollars to buy hotel rooms and flights for illegal immigrants. And so I guess there is an indirect way the federal government does take and seize these things, and they can appropriate the fungible assets that you have any way they want. So I guess that is maybe a backdoor way of making that happen, but certainly not directly.
Yeah, there was that story of that 94-year-old grandma who had paid taxes her entire life, and she had got $2,000 behind on her taxes. And then with fines for being late on her taxes, they ranked that up to $15,000. They seized her house, kicked her out of her house, evicted it, sold her house for $40,000, then kept her house, tried to keep all the profits. And somebody got involved. I don't know what organization helped her sue the government. She got the profits, but she was still kicked out of her home at 94.
Yeah, everyone here should just think about this. Do you really own your home? Do you own anything if you can lose it, if you don't pay the taxes on that thing? I mean, at this point, I think our founding fathers would have already been stacking bodies, because we're talking about the fact that every dollar you earn is taxed. Every dollar you spend is taxed. Every property you own is taxed when you buy it, and then taxed annually just for the mere sake of you holding on to it. So our taxes, my wife and I constantly are furious about this. There's a reason why the libertarians love to say that taxation is theft. It feels like theft when someone continues to extort you for your own property. Can you really own it? And then you're serving the government in this way. I mean, we have the feudal serfs in us have more in common than the free peoples of the early part of this nation. It's truly incredible. And I would love for a consumption tax or a flat tax or anything that makes sense. But none of this stuff is getting taxed on every single thing, every single time a dollar comes or goes. I think actually you showed me a thing from Andrew Tate the other day, Ryan, that was also very interesting. There's another tax that many of us are not aware of, and that's the tax of using credit cards, because there's a processing fee that goes along with all these things. And we're all so happy to pay it. Because it actually comes out of the business, and we act like, well, it's the business that has to pay it so they can accept this amount of money. No, you pay it because they jack up their prices to accommodate for the 1 to 2 to 3% that the credit card companies are engaged in. In the same way that when I used to work for Dell Incorporated, almost 20 years ago now, that we would give a discount if you used our financing because we were the ones who made the money on the payments and potentially would make interest on it. Or if you decided to pay direct with a debit card, you would actually be able to get away with not paying an extra 2 or 3%. We could instantly discount the product because the cost is 100% passed on to the consumer. It's just part of the way that businesses are baking in their operating costs right now. So we're all paying for this stuff. What else we got? We got Jigsaw, looks like.
Yeah, let's do
So
do 2 more and we'll wrap it up. So
all right, sounds good.
Yoma63, and this is a good one because I was talking to Kyle about these Faraday bags yesterday or last week. He says, is Faraday technology for real? Heard an ad for a phone sleeve. I actually have one. What's your thoughts on the Faraday bags, Kyle?
Okay, so Faraday technology, is the concept of it real? Yes. Is the idea of it real? Yes. You have to understand what the Faraday is supposed to do. It's supposed to block the wavelengths of radio signals coming to and from a radio receiving and sending device. So your phone operates on an RF frequency, that's radio frequency, and those waves have to come out. They have a certain size. Now, when you put them into a bag, the idea is that the grid is smaller than the size of the wavelength, and therefore it disrupts it, and therefore you do not get the signal inside the bag. If you want to know if your Faraday bag works, it's very easy. Put your phone inside the bag, leave it powered up, set it next to you. Then go and try to call it. If it rings, your Faraday bag did not work. There's always weaknesses on those bags. They all have different parts of them that could be weak. It could have too small of a size. There's a changing technology. There's multiple different bands and bandwidths that your phones can use. Most of them are tri or quad band. So know that. But try it out. The thing that we found that was most effective if you want to actually use Faraday technology is taking a bit of tinfoil and wrapping it seamlessly around your phone and then having it turned off. If you can remove the battery, even better. But even with an off phone with a battery in, it will collect things like your data and your location as you move around. You'll find that your ad markers are actually gathering and pinging Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and so on. So you can lock down some of these things, but without wrapping it and making it basically not useful, then it's never going to be totally effective. It is something they teach and they want people to use. There's a reason why CIA case officers leave phones behind, or they use a brand new fresh phone that's never been used when they go out and try to be operational. It is the single biggest surveillance piece that is following you around everywhere you go, and you do it voluntarily. And the trade-off is that it's highly convenient. And the downside is that these companies know more about your life than any federal surveillance program could ever hope to know. And the scary thing is the government can actually buy it without a warrant, as we've been seeing, because the case law there is not particularly helpful. So they can actually buy information about you specifically, types of people who are just like you and that sort of thing. And we've seen that sort of thing happening in more and more disclosures. Wired magazine's really good at keeping track of this. They kind of have a leftist bent, but they tend to be pretty good on the free speech and watching out for technology. So the technology is real, but it's limited. And if you're buying cheap Chinese bags that are coming in from Amazon, then you're probably getting what you paid for. You can always use foil rather, and put it into like a little metal box, like a gun safe box. And that will be a pretty good job if it's powered off.
Awesome. We'll go on to the next one. Jigsaw. I'd like to know if Ray actually thinks that he's selling fake stats about domestic terrorism, or if he actually believes that white supremacy extremists, homo transphobes are threatening our democracy.
I don't know what Ray believes. I don't want to put anything into his mouth. I know what he said. I know what he's testified to. And I know that he's gone out in front of Congress and pitched. And I know what kind of budgets they are pushing. And that's the fact that he claims that those things are all true. So we have to take him at his word. We shouldn't be trying to get inside the head of that man. What we know is a couple of things. Number one, he made $9.2 million the year before he became the FBI director. Now he makes $235,000 a year, flies around in a private jet, doesn't live in the place where his job is, and goes home on a private jet that the FBI pays for. And then he's incentivized to maintain the FBI as it is, which is to say an ever-growing budget and an ever-growing set of programs that have an increasing amount of power and I would say dangerous collection capabilities on the American people. So I'll take him at his word. I'm going to take that his word under penalty of perjury is what he thinks. Whether or not it's true or not, none of us will know what the inside of his heart is. But The scary piece is that they are incentivized to do this, and they are doing the thing that they are obviously incentivized to do, which is grow government agencies. That's what government agencies do. There's a reason why Friedman said it, and why Ronald Reagan is famous for sort of paraphrasing this thing. They say there's nothing closer to eternal life on earth than a government program, and we witnessed that. I highly doubt we will see the destruction of the FBI, even though it has earned it in many, many ways for literally decades. There's decades worth of sins, whether you go back to them hunting down the First Amendment protected beliefs of communists in the 20s and 30s, which was one of the reasons that they actually came up, whether it was, that's a great visual, whether it was them going after the civil rights leaders and the people that were doing that. So it's interesting that not only were they going after and investigating Emmett Till at the time when Emmett Till was killed, and they were investigating the Klan, but they were also trying to get Martin Luther King Jr. to kill himself at the exact same time, right? These things seem antithetical, and that's why you have to understand that these government agencies are not monolithic, but they do tend towards authoritarianism. They tend towards increased budgets, and they are individuals who just want to advance their own power, prestige, notoriety, retirement gigs, and so on. And I don't think Ray is special when it comes to that. In fact, I think he's sort of less special, having been in the same room with the guy. He doesn't command a whole lot. Let's shut that thing right down. And folks, we'll do some of these every once in a while when there's a lot of, I saw the live chat was just going off today. And so I think I can appreciate that we want to do some Q&A. We'll do some of these later on. We'll do a Twitter space once a week as well. And so if you guys want to jump on Twitter, you can follow me at Kyle Seraphin. Again, at Kyle Seraphin on Truth and Twitter. There's a subscriber button at some point that they're going to authorize, and we're going to try to do some special things in there. Some motivational messages and what's kind of keeping me from being completely black-pilled from reading some of this stuff and having these thoughts and being inside the government. And then also we're going to try to do some Q&A special just for our subscribers at some point. We will work this thing out. So anyway, don't lose hope. We're still in the fight. Like I said, forewarned is forearmed. There's a reason why we do these things. There's a reason why you're listening. And the reason is that you can be prepared and not be doomed to suffer the same fates as the Japanese Americans with 1/16 Japanese blood who were thrown into camps by the 120,000 under FDR and the so-called transformational experience of that time. Let's not repeat that stuff. Let's be aware. Let's be awake. Let's be keeping our eyes out there, and go meet your neighbors, because your neighbors are much less likely to agree with that thing when they know who you are and they know that you're a decent person. So go do those things. Go shake hands with a neighbor. Go touch some grass. Get off the internet today. Thanks so much for joining us, guys.
Thanks for listening to The Kyle Seraphin Show, streamed live Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays on rumble.com/Kyle Seraphin. Follow Kyle on Twitter and Truth Social at Kyle Seraphin.